Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the JSWCD Brown Bag Lunch with the Conservationists about ponds. So my name is Paul DiMaggio. I'm the Soil and Water Conservation Engineer here at the Jackson Soil and Water Conservation District. I'm an agricultural engineer by trade. My main schooling was irrigation related. So my main view when I look at ponds is from an irrigation perspective, but through working in Jackson County over the last 8 years, I've learned a lot more about ponds just from talking with a lot of folks doing site visits that we do at the district, and hoping to share some of that info we've gained with you all today and hope to answer some of your questions. Clint, you want to introduce yourself? We've got a couple other Jackson Soil and Water Conservation District employees here as well. So,
sure. Yeah. So my name is Clint Nichols. I am the Forest and Riparian Resource Conservationist with Jackson Soil and Water Conservation District. So what that basically means is that my area of focus is on riparian restoration and other riparian management projects. And then I do a lot of upland projects as well. So that could include forestry, forest health, wildfire preparedness, and other sort of upland habitat projects. Yeah, and sort of just piggybacking off of what Paul said too, I've kind of seen the same thing. It's I think everybody has a different goal for their pond. It seems like every site visit that we've been on, somebody has something a little bit different that they're using their pond for. So it's definitely made it interesting to try and make sure that we have good guidance for all of those different uses and resource concerns.
cool. Thanks, Clint. Megan, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, my name is Megan Montgomery. I'm also a staff member here at Jackson Soil and Water, and I'm the Agriculture Resource Conservationist. So I work with Paul on a lot of our irrigation and agriculture related projects, more on the kind of upland ecosystem functioning, whether that's like the functioning of a pasture or restoration of some kind of dryland area or something like that. And I'm actually relatively new to the Rogue Valley, and so ponds for irrigation or wildlife purposes on private land are relatively new to me. But we've worked now with a couple of landowners that have put them in or who have wanted to restore their function in various ways. So I can share a little bit of what I've learned to do that.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Looks like we're still getting a couple people rolling in, but we'll just keep going here. I'll just touch real quick about just some of the general pond purposes I've seen and just some general topics to get everyone thinking about some different things. And then I'll go over some questions and answers that I've received through email recently. So that way, you know, if multiple people have same questions, I can address those questions kind of once at a time. And then we'll kind of open it up for some general question and answers. And also while I'm talking, feel free to open up the chat box and type in your question. I think that'll be the most effective way for everyone to see the question. And then we'll make sure to get to answering all those questions as we move along. So thanks again for showing up. This is a great turnout. We've got about 10 folks here, so thanks. All right. So to start off, like what Clint was talking about, there's a lot of different purposes for your pond. It can be aesthetic for your property. Everyone likes to live near water, and ponds can actually increase the selling value of your property if they're properly maintained. And I'm going to be touching on that maintenance issue a lot because we see that all the time. Another option for your pond could be an irrigation necessity. So your irrigation season could be short. You could have a limited water supply, either from an irrigation district or from a seasonal creek. and you need to store that additional water either on your rotation from your irrigation district or in the beginning of the season for a seasonal creek so that you can use it later in the season for irrigating your pasture or your crops. These type of ponds and reservoirs can be pretty large, over 700 acre feet storage capacity, all the way down to really small to maybe 1 or 2 acre feet storage capacity. And they can be pretty useful for irrigation purposes. On those small ponds, sometimes they're just an enlarged area for the pump to go into. So if you're irrigating out of a creek or out of a spring or some wet area in your field, the pond comes out of a necessity to just increase that volume of water going into your pump so your pump doesn't dry up. Other purposes for a pond could be increased wildlife habitat, or you could have it be a stockwater pond, which we see a lot. So there's a wet area in the field and your livestock are trying to access this wet area, which may be caused by a seep or a spring. And a previous landowner or you have gone and dug that area, that wet area out to access that clean water so that your livestock can get a good drink of water without getting up to their knees in muck. So that's mainly a stockwater type of pond. The age of building a lot of new ponds seems to be dwindling here in Jackson County. So a lot of ponds have been built in the past. And now at this point in time, we see a lot of people moving in to properties that already have a pond or had a historic pond that was built sometimes 50, 100 years ago. And so we run into a lot of, why was this pond here? How can I maintain this pond for its purpose? Also, what type of purpose do I, as the new landowner, want to have on this pond? And is that going to be worthwhile for me to keep up this pond with the amount of maintenance I'm going to have to do to this pond on an annual basis, and likely how much effort it's going to take to kind of reestablish this pond? Because typically, or a lot of times we've seen it 20, 30, 40 times where an older landowner just getting ready to sell their property will forego the maintenance on the pond for 5, 10 years or so while they're transitioning away from the property. And then someone new comes in, purchases the property, and now this pond is in complete disrepair, fully grown with weeds. The banks are degraded. And so maintenance and reestablishment is a big question we get a lot of times. So again, if you got any questions as I'm going through there, type them in the chat. I see we have a couple of them here too.
I'm working on that one if you want.
What's that?
I'm writing up a response for that one.
Okay, yeah, why don't you go for that, and then I'll touch on some other questions on these emails I've got. So the question is, if we have a seasonal creek, are we allowed to deepen areas to provide water for wildlife? So Clint, you wanted to touch on that one?
Yeah, so typically within any stream, whether it's perennial, seasonal, any sort of soil disturbance within that floodplain or floodway requires a permit from Department of State Lands, sometimes from the Army Corps of Engineers. Every site is specific, so typically what I will have landowners do if they are thinking about doing some work like that, I will direct them pretty much straight to the regulatory agency to find out whether or not, yeah, maybe Ryan can add to it too. He's Ryan at ODF has much more, and W has much more experience with dealing with that kind of stuff than we've done in the past. So But yeah, typically any sort of soil disturbance is going to trigger, is going to require a permit. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself real quick?
Hey, I guess good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ryan Battleson, and I'm one of our fisheries biologists with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, located out of the Denman Wildlife area. My program is the Salmon Trout Enhancement Program. We do a number of things, often involving citizens, conservation groups, fishermen groups, schools, but we do everything from fish propagation to habitat enhancement, presentations, and education and outreach. So great question, Julie. Yeah, a lot of our local streams in the area are seasonal streams. And something that we've definitely seen, folks might have a creek on their property that might be wet 6, 7, 8 months out of the year, and then it goes dry. Those actually are very important habitat for fish species like summer steelhead, for example. Most of our summer steelhead, they've all evolved in these seasonal streams. And so going in and disturbing some of that soil or any of the bed and banks definitely requires a Department of State Lands permit. And that's going to also typically have a consultation with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Some of the things we've been definitely talking about in specific sites, doing some more pool construction, actually. One of the unfortunate things with just a legacy of essentially large wood and stuff being removed from creeks and having fully functional riparian areas is a lot of times when those large trees or root wads fall into creeks, they help to naturally just, slow down water, scour out banks and create natural habitat for juvenile fish. That's something that I would encourage all landowners, if you want to do for streamside stewardship, is to actually leave large wood and root wads in the creeks. A lot of folks think they got to remove that. It's a little tougher when you're in, municipalities and stuff, but if you live out in the country and something's not really eroding your bank, there can often be solutions. You can get a hold of Clint or Paul and me as well, and we can find solutions for you guys. But yeah.
On another side of that, for a seasonal creek that has a pump or an irrigation diversion out of the creek, you're typically allowed to maintain that irrigation diversion to an extent as it has historically been maintained. But that's for irrigation purposes, not necessarily for wildlife. Tom, you have a good question. We can touch on that too. I got an email from Corellia. She had gotten a call from you, so she forwarded that on to me. So thanks for touching on that here. I don't have a lot of experience with duckweed. I know Ryan probably has more experience with dealing with mosquitoes and mosquito fish than us. So I don't know, Ryan, would you like to touch on the mosquitoes portion, and then maybe Clint, if you want to talk about duckweed, if you got something to say. Thanks.
Thanks for the question, Tom. So ODFW does not, we don't give out mosquito fish. There's actually a little misconception there. Jackson County Vector Control actually over off of Mosquito Road off of Table Rock, where Table Rock and Antelope meet. Those guys, the Vector Control is who does mosquito fish. I do want to mention something about mosquito fish though. We do not like to see mosquito fish in any moving waters of the state, or if there's a way for mosquito fish to get into essentially seasonal streams or perennial streams. They're not a native to the Rogue Basin. We have them, but we like to try and keep them in ponds. A lot of times folks have an overflow in their pond, and that's a great way for those fish species to remove or to escape. We get a lot of introductions of non-native species. Probably most famously is the Umpqua pike minnow, aka the squawfish. We call it the pike minnow these days, though. But that was introduced in a pond actually in Wolf Creek, and something, especially if you are going to be having mosquito fish, or for that matter, bluegill, bass. ODFW strongly well, it's a requirement if you're stocking fish in your pond to have that screen so that fish can't escape. But if you do have a pond that maybe has fish in it that you didn't put in, but it was historical there, definitely encourage folks to put screens on there so that we're not getting more introductions of these species into our flowing water bodies. And then really last thing, I'll let Clint talk more about the duckweed, but I think shading and controlling your nutrients is the best thing I know. There are some products also, and the soil and water conservation guys might be able to steer you that direction.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Yes, the question on the pond. So I would go back if you're not having some success with those mosquito fish. I would go back to vector control and see if they have any other recommendations. So they regularly treat ponds. They regularly treat ponds throughout Jackson County, and they have different products that they use. Some are, I don't know if I call them organic. I'm not sure what the compounds are, but they're, it's not like your typical like broad spectrum insecticides that they can treat ponds with. I'm not, like I said, I'm not totally sure like the chemical compounds in it, but they might be able to give you some ideas on some good ways to treat it. The topic of duckweed is one of those ones where it really depends on what you're using your pond for. So if it's specifically for irrigation, or if it's for like a swimming hole or recreation, then yeah, duckweed is one of those things that's not great to have in your pond because it can choke up your filters. It can, just be kind of a gross thing to kind of swim in. If they're habitat ponds, then a certain amount of that aquatic vegetation is actually kind of nice to have. Can kind of provide cover for some aquatic organisms. You don't want it as a soupy mess across the entire pond, but some amount of it isn't too bad. So yeah, but like kind of what Ryan had touched on, and Paul, at some point, what we could do, that woodland pond thing that you had shared a little bit ago, that actually has some really good instructions on dealing with aquatic vegetation.
It does. I'm on the vegetation control page right now. Do you want me to share the screen?
Yeah, go ahead. But yeah, shading and nutrient management is really sort of the best way to kind of manage your aquatic vegetation. Again, if it is an irrigation pond, or if you're using that pond and that aquatic vegetation is a problem, then it's, finding a way to either circulate the water or shade the water, and then making sure that there's no excess nutrients that's getting into it, either from stormwater runoff or things like that. There are certain herbicides that you can use that will kill that different types of aquatic vegetation. And I believe this document actually goes into the different types of herbicides that are used for different types of aquatic weeds.
It does, yeah. There's a lot of chemical herbicides you can use, and a lot of folks use them.
Yeah, there's like emergent and submergent vegetation. There's free-floating vegetation, and each one will respond differently to specific herbicides. And so, and there may be some, more organic or more environmentally friendly. A lot of those, tend to just be sort of synthetic compounds that are used to treat an aquatic setting. So, but yeah, it really comes back to like what the use to the pond is and how much of a problem it is.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Clint. Yeah, I'll just touch on this document real quick. This is scroll up here to the top, Woodland Ponds Field Guide from Oregon State University Extension Service. This is probably one of the best resources we've found that just covers all things ponds. A lot of resources out there that I've seen before this one were really geared towards how to construct a pond, planning, design from more of an engineering perspective. And that's all well and good. And that can really help with the overall maintenance of the pond. But like I was saying earlier, a lot of times we're moving into now, we're not building new ponds as much as we were before. We're trying to maintain these ponds that have already been built. So, but this document also covers a lot of the maintenance tasks in detail, like Clint was saying. on there. So feel free to access this. This is free online. If you Google Woodland Ponds, Oregon State University, this should pop up. And that's a good resource. I was just looking at the aquatic or vegetation control section here, which is a big one because maintenance, like as you can see on this pond, there's a lot of cattails, a lot of vegetation on the pond. Excellent habitat for fish and wildlife, but not the best for if you're actively trying to fish the pond or recreate in the pond. So it really depends on what you're trying to do with the pond. And alternatively, if the maintenance becomes too much of a task, you know, draining the pond or just eliminating the pond altogether and turning it into another area is always an option for landowners. And that will be the least maintenance of all, is just removing your pond. So I'll go through here. Let me see, anybody have any more questions? Can't see the screen.
Was there a question on screen size, I thought?
Oh yeah.
So, you know, screening. So like I mentioned, if you're going to stock fish, I'm sorry if I'm jumping in.
No, please.
If folks are going to be stocking fish greater than 6 inches in length, I believe our recommendation is a 1/4 inch screening. Anything smaller than that, I think it gets down to 1/8 inch screening. And it's mainly, you think, oh, 6 inch fish, a 1/4 inch, they can't get out of there. But if you're you know, putting bluegill or something in there, bluegill breed prolifically, and their fry are pretty small, and so it at least tries to stop some of the smaller fish from escaping. Yeah, having a low point typically on your pond, you'll look at the landscape and find the lowest spot, and that's usually where there's already an overflow. Folks can have just a simple culvert and have a screen on the upstream side or the pond side, and then the downstream side. We recommend having 2 screens back to back, so that when you're picking one up and cleaning it, there's still a screen in there and fish aren't escaping. But yeah, weed management is a big thing, especially if you've got your pond screened. But if you're gonna have fish in there, that's the cost of doing business. So
yeah, thanks, Ryan. So on that maintenance side, I'll talk about a question. Is there an economical way to dredge out my pond? This is a bulge pond we're talking about, which means that the pond is not in the water channel. It's kind of set offside next to the irrigation canal. Is there an economical way to dredge out my pond? I've got about 70 years worth of muck at the bottom. So it hasn't been maintained by the previous landowner potentially. Is there a way to clear out all that muck and sediment that's gotten in there while also spreading that out on my field to increase the organic matter for the crops I'm trying to grow? I think that's a great idea and something that comes up a lot. And you're typically allowed to clean out the muck from your pond as long as you fall within the Department of State Lands permitting requirements. So a pond is usually considered a wetland, and it may be either connected to an essential salmonid habitat or not. In the case of a bulge pond that's used for irrigation only, it's usually in an upland setting that doesn't have a natural stream running through it. That's kind of non-connected. So you're allowed to, without a permit, remove 50 cubic yards of material per year without getting a DSL permit. If you want to remove more than that, you need to get a Department of State Lands permit, and you can call Department of State Lands, the lady over there. I'll put her contact info on here on the message deal here real quick, but she's super helpful. and she can tell you if you need or don't need a permit. It's always a good idea to call and ask. So this is going to have to be done. You're going to have to dredge the pond or excavate out the muck that gets into your pond every couple years or so. And that muck that gets into your pond can be from leaves from nearby trees. So if you have a lot of trees growing around the outside of your pond, you're going to fill up your pond with leaves and aquatic or material faster than you would if you had a pond that only had grass around it and not too many trees around. Another concern is the inflow. So if you're getting water from an irrigation source that is high in sediment, that's just dark and chocolatey, when you're putting water into the pond, you're gonna over time fill up your pond with sediment, and you're gonna have to clean that out. So that should be a expected maintenance for your ponds. Otherwise, the pond will eventually fill in with all vegetation and cattail and turn into more of a swampy, marshy area, which if that's what you're going for wildlife habitat, that's great. That's a low maintenance way to get some nice wildlife habitat in there, and you don't have to dredge it. So for spreading that sediment and that material back onto a field, I was going to have to do some more research on that, about the best way to do that. But I imagine you put it in a holding area, let it dry out a little bit so that you can either put it in a spreader and spread it out, or some way like that to just get it out on the field without putting big clumps of wet material onto your crops in kind of a non-uniform way. Letting it dry out so you can shoot it out would be kind of a good way to do that. And, you know, historically in floodplains for agricultural production, every year the rivers would get high, flood a certain area, deposit sediment and organic matter over this floodplain, and then that area in turn will become one of the higher producing agricultural regions. So definitely that organic matter in the bottom of the pond and that sediment can add to your crop production if done properly. We got a comment from Ryan. Yeah, Ryan, you want to touch on that real quick? Just consulting with DSL and ODFW. So you can always call ODFW, probably call Ryan. Are you the guy to call for this for Jackson County also?
Yeah, folks who call myself, Pete Samarin, or Dan. We will all take the calls. We've actually got a great Department of State Lands representative, Lauren Brown. She's excellent. She's pretty timely in her responses as well. But we get every question you could possibly think of. But yeah, some essential salmonid habitat. A lot of times, folks won't think that. It's mainly like if your pond is off channel, you're not going to be an ESH. But if you're an on channel pond, there could potentially be miles of habitat upstream of your pond. Kind of touching back to that screen discussion, maybe we don't want to put a screen on a pond like that because you actually might be blocking fish passage seasonally. If you're going to be touching anything within the bed and banks of a creek that is mapped ESH, you have to notify DSL and ODFW. But if you're outside of essential salmonid habitat, which you can find on it's on the DSL website, you could just Google ESH or essential salmonid habitat and DSL Oregon, and you should be able to find an interactive map that you can see where you're at. If that's maybe not in the cards, give us a call and we will look it up and we can tell you yes or no. So you might even have salmon or steelhead in your creek, and it might not be salmon and essential salmon habitat. Usually that's like larger tributaries and stuff, but it's all connected. And so whatever you're doing, if you're mucking things up, you should try and limit the sedimentation and stuff that's going downriver.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
And Mary Ann asked a question. Original owner of my property created depressions, kind of seasonal ponds in the path of a seasonal stream runoff that comes down the hill. there's a conduit under the road, East Antelope Road that goes to Antelope Creek potentially. If the drought should subside, can I request to enlarge, deepen any of the 4 ponds? So I would ask Mary Ann, what is your intent for the ponds? Are they for storing irrigation water or other? And put yourself, I think you're on mute right now, Mary Ann.
When I first got here over 20 years ago, we did have rain and the ponds up. The deepest one would be overflowing. The original owner did have 2 tubes, conduits from the upper area to the deep one. Just concerned if we get into greater water flow than what we have had. I am concerned about the overflow of the ponds and the sides getting broken down, the downhill. So I was just looking at if that would be a potential, just looking down the road, I do.
Sure, yeah, good concern. A concern with ponds is always, when is it gonna blow out? When is the dam gonna fail? Is the outlet gonna get clogged and is the dam gonna overtop? Or is, like in that case, if there's a culvert or an outlet pipe through the dam face, then sometimes those culverts can get clogged over time with sediment and debris that falls into the pond with sticks, and it'll build up and kind of clog that outlet. And then that water needs to find another place to go over the pond. And sometimes it can go over and just decimate your pond. So the easiest fix to do would be, if you're not, utilizing the ponds for anything really super necessary, would be to just eliminate those ponds and reshape that channel and revegetate that channel to keep it from eroding during those seasonal rainstorms.
Oh, okay.
So if you do try to block up that water kind of cascading down, it's just going to be maintaining all those ponds, maintaining all those outlets, maintaining all the spillways. But if you don't necessarily need that, maybe those were put in for stockwater purposes previously, or just because people like having ponds on their property. But yeah, it's no problem to eliminate those ponds and reestablish that waterway. I would also talk to Department of State Lands as well to see if you would need any type of permit, and talk to ODFW too to see the best way to eliminate or remove those ponds. Then you won't have to deal with the maintenance anymore, or the thought of overtopping the pond and having a catastrophic event.
Okay.
So,
I do have some sheep, a small amount of livestock. I don't have irrigation, so I'm very contained in the number that I can handle.
mm-hmm.
Would there be an issue? I just started it up the past couple of years. I've never let them along the creek and those ponds. Would there be an issue with, the water's not going to be staying there all year, but for when the water is there, would it be okay for the sheep to, set up some fencing around it for the sheep?
Yeah, it's okay to have livestock drink out of the water running through your property. So that's an exempt water use. You don't need a special water right for that. The proper way to do it would be to allow them a certain small amount of access to that water source that is a hardened area.
Yeah.
You fence around the whole area, and then you have a notch in the fence, maybe 8 feet wide, with some rocks laid down so that they go in, access the water, and then come out. That's an effective way to do it. Alternatively, fencing the whole area and having a nose pump is pretty effective, or a small solar pump. A nose pump is like Well, it's a livestock controlled pump
Oh.
where the pipe goes into the water and it comes out, and then the livestock pushes on the pump with their nose, and water shoots out into a little catchment and they can drink out of there. And those can be pretty effective. It's not as fail-safe, obviously, as just having a notch in the fence. So if you're gone a lot or you really need the livestock to have water, it's not super good for super rural areas, you know. But in your case, if you are constantly there watching the sheep, having something like that can be good. Or you can allow the livestock to drink water from your well or another source of water too. So
We've just been filling tanks wherever we have them at. I've been trying to learn about pastures and that sort of stuff. And there was a discussion about ponds and the livestock breaking down the edges of the ponds. So, which I don't want to have happen either. Yeah,
Right.
This is all new to me. I'm a military nurse by trade. This is new stuff. But the nose pump and the having a hardened area for them to approach that hadn't been mentioned before. So I like
great,
that.
good.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was a good question. Okay, looks like we got some other questions as well. Clint had to head out. Pond aeration. So aerating the pond can be an effective way of reducing some weeds. And that can be, I've seen people will put little generators and they'll pump air through a pipe, and the pipe ends at the bottom of their pond, and there's a little aeration deal under there, and it allows the bubbles to come up and mix in the pond. And that is usually used if there's not enough water inflow and out of the pond to kind of recycle that water through. So you don't really need aeration if you are pumping a lot of water into your pond or putting a lot of water into your pond and taking a lot of water out. If you can, I think, replace the water in your pond every couple of days, about looking at my reference, every couple of days, then you shouldn't need any aeration. But that's hard to do with some of these off-channel ponds. So aeration can be helpful. It just can be more expensive than people think. And so I haven't seen a lot of it done out here. But so that's aeration. So with dredging a pond out, I'll just continue on some of these questions. You can use a backhoe to scoop the water out or scoop out the muck. You can use an extend-a-hoe backhoe to get even further out. You can dry up your pond and get in there and scoop out the muck. It's a difficult task. You can take a boat out there and scoop out the muck that way. It's a heavy maintenance task, and one that isn't done regularly, as seen by a lot of major reservoirs and dams that are beginning to be silted in now and are losing their storage capacity because they haven't been dredged out or cleaned out over the last 50 years. So it can be an expensive process, and sometimes it can be cheaper to just get rid of the whole pond and start from scratch and rebuild the whole pond. So that's something to look at. Try to find some contractors who are good at earthwork, and ask if they've done any pond work before. There's some technical points on building a pond to reduce seepage and leakage in your pond dam face and your banks. So try to find a contractor who has done that before. I don't have any specific folks in mind. I've only worked with a handful of contractors who have done pond construction considerably. So we got some questions being answered back and forth in the chat. Can everybody see the chat box there? Yeah. Okay, good.
I could maybe clarify my answer. I don't mean to be
Thanks.
But I was kind of responding to Liz as well as Marianne. I liked Marianne talking about her seasonal ponds, and then Liz has a small pond that she wants to dig out. So, you know, I don't mean to be the total Debbie Downer, but despite a lot of folks' best intentions, a lot of folks say, well, they want these ponds for wildlife. We have probably more standing water in the Rogue Basin now than we've probably ever had, actually, prior to when some of our floodplains were reconnected with the main Rogue River and its tributaries. But in terms of small ponds, I mean, these things are actually, you should ask yourself, what kind of wildlife do you want to attract? And so pretty much every pond that I see is going to have non-native bullfrogs in it. And non-native bullfrogs are pretty hardcore predators on native species, such as our yellow-legged frogs, western pond turtles, and they do a pretty good job on chowing down on those native species. So yeah, from my standpoint, I don't think a lot of times we're necessarily needing more standing water body in the road. What we need is the sources of those ponds, which were springs and seeps, which usually has cold water. And you know, if that stuff was allowed to get into creeks, that is going to be a great resource for juvenile steelhead, juvenile salmon, juvenile coho salmon, things like that. So if you have a pond and it's been there for years, that's great. If you are going to be, if you want to let it kind of go back natural, I would support that. If you are going to be digging it out, though, one thing to keep in mind is you can't be, especially if it has a dam or something associated with it, you can't be increasing the footprint of that pond. And so if you are going in there to maintain it, that's fine. But if you're trying to make the thing bigger, you're going to have to consult with water resources and probably ODFW as well. So
I'll just piggyback a little bit on what Ryan was saying, that if what you're wanting is aesthetics and wildlife habitat benefit on that pond, that letting it, like you said, letting it fill in and kind of naturally revert to something that's more like a seasonal wetland might be beneficial. And we can help you out if you want with picking plant species that can tolerate that. Like in the wintertime, they're totally saturated and they're in water. And then in the summer, when all the rain stops and everything, they can tolerate being dried out, and they get both those extremes. And a lot of native species really like the habitat benefits that those provide. And so it won't be a pond habitat, but it'll still be really great wildlife habitat on your property.
Well, thanks, Megan. Megan, do you have anything to add to Tom's question there about seasonal pond with hemlock in it?
That one I'm not entirely certain about. It's probably something that you would want to deal with during the dry season, preferably to the wet season. And there are some like aquatic approved herbicides you could consider. Hemlock you can also pull as long as you are hitting it before it goes to flower, and you're kind of wearing protected gear. But if you send me a direct message with your email address, in the chat box you can kind of specify if it goes to everyone or just to me. And I can look that up for you and kind of draw up what you might do in the timing of that. Something to be kind of careful of because it is a toxic plant, and being really cognizant about what you're using to treat it.
Yeah, good question. So I'll just move forward on some of these other questions that I've gotten. We've talked about algae and cattails. So with older ponds, they may begin to leak and seep over time. They may develop cracks, and some of these cracks in the pond bank or the dam can be caused by a lot of times large trees or vegetation that are growing right on the dam face or right on the embankment. And these large trees have big roots that go down, and they will grow where there's water, and they'll grow in, and then some of these trees might die, or some of the roots might die, and that leaves a big space in that dam for water to get in and water to find its way to seep out. Rodent damage is a big problem on dams and dikes, mainly on skinnier dams, so like on irrigation canals where the actual dam is maybe only 6-8 feet wide, or even smaller in some irrigation districts. You can get a couple rodents in there and you could have a irrigation ditch blowout on that dike, which that dike that holds the irrigation canal in is basically a long, skinny dam, similar to what you would have on a pond. So if you've got a pond, though, to prevent rodent damage, just make it extra wide, 10 or so feet wide on that pond embankment, on that dam, to prevent the rodents from really going all the way through to prevent a blowout. And definitely don't plant any trees on the dam itself. You can plant trees near the uphill side where it's not holding back any water. But again, those trees are going to add vegetation to your water, and they'll increase the amount of maintenance you'll have to do over time. So if you see any small trees coming up on your dam face, immediately chop them down. You should really only have a thick grasses growing on your dam in any area that's actually impounding the water. If you currently have a large tree on the dam or on the dike and you see that it's leaking from around that tree, the only way to stop that would be if you cut down the tree, you're likely going to increase your leakage because now those roots are going to die and allow more water to flow through those root spaces. You're going to have to chop the tree down and cut that entire root ball out of the dam and rebuild the whole dam to really fix that seepage issue. So if you see a lot of seepage on the dam, just keep an eye on it. Every dams have a little bit of seepage and a little bit of leakage. So if you see it increasing over time or increasing really quick, keep an eye on it. Try to drain the pond so there's no catastrophic blowouts that could harm your neighbor downhill or something. But otherwise, if it's just seeping a little bit or if it's a little moist at the bottom edge of the dam, not a huge concern. They'll seep a little bit. Another way to fix a leaky pond is to drain the whole thing and reline the whole inside of the pond with something that won't let water through. So a good one in this area, since we have a lot of clay soil, is to line it with, it's called a clay liner, which is basically a compacted 1 foot thick clay cap that's all in that pond, that's compacted. And when that gets wet, it'll swell up a little bit and it'll totally seal that pond off. So any deficiencies in the dam itself or in any other banks will be mitigated by that 12-inch thick clay cap or clay liner in there. If you don't have access to clay soil that's at least 20% clay, you can mix like your native soil there, if it's a sandy or loamy soil, with a material called bentonite, which kind of acts as like a super extreme clay on steroids that expands a lot when it gets wet. So you mix that in with the soil that you have, you line all the pond, and then once you get it wet initially, it'll swell up and seal your pond. That's the most economical way to do it for large ponds. On small ponds, using a pond liner or a synthetic pond liner, it's like a big rubber mat, plastic, is a good way to prevent leaks in your pond. And those are especially good for irrigation ponds because they last a pretty long time, and you can really ensure that you're not having any water seeping out of your pond. So the takeaway on that one is, when you're maintaining your pond, make sure there's no large vegetation growing on your dam. That goes for blackberries too. Don't let a lot of blackberries grow on your dam because they can obscure the visual of if any seepage is happening along that dam, along the pond. If it's all covered in a bunch of blackberries, you don't know if there's more or less seepage coming out of that pond. You really want to chop those down and just have it be a nice grassy area that you can go walk around on. That's at a gentle slope so that you can mow it without tipping over you or your mower. I got some regarding sealing ponds. When you talk about sealing ponds with clay, this is a question from Aluna. Are you talking only about the inside of the pond or also the top of the pond dam or face of it? Would sealing those sides be helpful for preventing blowouts? Good question. When I talk about sealing a pond, you're really just sealing where it's touching the water. So you're right between the water and the soil is where that sealing is going to be. Same thing with a synthetic pond liner. You don't need to wrap the whole outside of the pond with that plastic liner. You just need to put where the water is touching it on the inside of the pond. That being said, large trees with lots of roots will slow down dam blowouts. So that's a misconception of that the tree is actually holding the bank together. It is in a sense, while also contributing to more seepage loss from your pond. And eventually that tree is going to die. Trees don't last forever. And then when it does die, it could fall over and create a large hole in your dam, and then your dam will blow out. So having trees is really not a good benefit for having trees on the dam. And the reason you see a lot of trees on some of these irrigation district dikes for their canals is that because they haven't gone in and cut them down when they're too small. And now that they've gotten larger, they're more afraid of having to go in and clean them all out. So they're just kind of monitoring them and making sure none of them fall over and making sure the root ball doesn't fall over and destroy the whole irrigation district canal face. There's a lot of ways to get water out of a pond. So you may have a pipe through the bottom of your dam at the lowest point of your pond. And that can be used for irrigation outflow or just to drain the pond. But not all ponds have that pipe at the bottom of the dam. They don't have an outlet works. But usually if you do, there's a screen, a rough grate on that pipe going through your dam and some type of valve. Old ponds, that valve is usually very leaky and it doesn't seal correctly. So replacing that valve is important. Also, the grate or the intake structure where the water flows into that pipe, which then goes under your dam and out, that can become rusted or can fall in or become totally surrounded by materials. And really the only way to, well, a good way to clean that out is just drain the whole pond. If you can, either pump it all out or drain it as you can, and then go and rebuild that inlet structure, that grate for your outlet pipe. There's a lot of different ways to build that outlet pipe. If you're interested in some examples, I can send you something. Yeah, Ryan, why don't you talk a little bit about the pond sealing, what you've seen on there?
Well, maybe it's pond sealing or maybe it's just I guess if you have I just want to talk about if you have a pond on channel, so on a stream, on a seasonal stream, on a perennial stream, and you are starting to make kind of repairs to that structure. If there's significant repairs, and that means pretty much more than if there's like a roadway or something going on over it and you're just kind of doing roadway repairs, that's fine. But if you start significantly making repairs to that structure, there could potentially be what's known in the fish world as a trigger event. And so if that pond were to just say blow out in a winter storm, then that's for sure a trigger event. And what a trigger is essentially you're going to have to address fish passage. And, you know, a lot of times ODFW we will be getting involved if you've had a full blowout. If you are per se blocking fish passage, that doesn't mean that you can't have the pond in the future, but you're going to have to address fish passage. And so if you think you're having an issue with that, you definitely might want to at least talk with us, and we can tell you what you can and can't do in terms of preventative maintenance on that. So
Good. Yeah, thanks. That's a good point. So talked a little bit about drain. So apart from getting water out of your pond through a drain on the bottom of your dam there, you can just have a overflow outlet where it maintains the pond at a certain level, and once it gets over that level, it flows out a safe area, usually around your dam, and then that can flow either through culvert pipe under like a dam access road, or an open canal, open channel away from your dam. And those need to be maintained as well, especially if they're vegetated. They can get clogged up with vegetation, or even clogged up with beavers can come in and clog up where there's any running water coming in or going out of your dam.
I'll mention beavers, and the ODFW, we do have a publication called Living with Beavers. So if, from a fish guy's perspective, beavers are pretty awesome, particularly if they're on a creek. From a landowner's perspective or agriculture perspective, they can also be kind of a pest. So there's a number of ways to deal with beavers on your property. There's, of course, the lethal method. From a wildlife perspective, at least I would encourage you to see if you can perhaps live with them. Depending on where you live in the watershed, if you're having beaver issues, say on just fruit trees or trees along your pasture or something that's next to a creek, I may be able to find fencing for you to try and girdle the trees or wrap the fencing around the trees. But there's exclusion devices and stuff, and we do have a publication. So if someone's interested in that, they could check out our Living with Wildlife on our website. Otherwise, give me a call and I'll forward it to you.
Great. I'm actually going to look that up right now. Living with Beavers, ODFW. Yeah, Living with Wildlife. Cool, great. Living with Wildlife here. So I'll just copy that link right in here. Yeah, and like you said, beavers are great wildlife to have around if your goal is wildlife, and I encourage anyone to keep beavers around and keep them in there because they provide a lot of benefits to wildlife. But yeah, sometimes you just can't afford to have a beaver build a dam on your outlet of your pond so that your pond dam blows out and you wash away your structure. But yeah, definitely something to keep in mind. Thanks, Ryan. That's kind of all I have. If I missed anything, please chime in. Looks like I got a question from Aluna. Line it with a pond liner with a permit. Yeah, Luna, that's like a water rights question. You're allowed to catch rainwater in a pond even without a liner. That's what I clarified with Siobhan, I think a little bit ago, was they consider ponds to be an artificial surface because usually they're lined with some type of compacted clay. It doesn't necessarily have to be a synthetic liner to be able to catch rainwater. So you can have a pond and you can divert rainwater from your roof into your pond as long as that rainwater doesn't touch the Oregon ground before it gets to your pond. So you can't divert rainwater in a natural channel into your pond. You have to divert rainwater into your pond through from an artificial surface. So yeah, you don't need a permit, but if you're digging a large hole, Aluna, you may need to get a Jackson County earthwork permit. There's other permits out there available for construction for safety reasons. But yeah, that can be a cheaper alternative to catching rainwater than buying a tank. However, tanks are easier to maintain over the long run than a open hole in the ground is. And it's easier to filter what goes in, and it's easier to get water out of a tank as well. So I haven't seen a lot of those, but I get a lot of that question. But everyone that's catching rainwater in Jackson County is using a tank usually. So yeah, you're welcome. So yeah, if there's nothing else to add, it's about 1:06. We have this scheduled until 1:30. So if you guys think of any other questions, please either reach out to myself, Clint, Megan, Ryan. Thanks a lot for joining in. That was super helpful. And we'll try to either answer your question or find the resources to answer your question.
Yeah, thanks y'all for being here, and I'll get back to you, Liz, on your questions about plant suggestions for that pond area.
Thank you. This is enlightening. More knowledge.
Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Aluna.
Appreciate everybody joining in. I want to make a pitch. If folks are on small seasonal streams right now that are drying up, I mean, we're kind of late in that. If you live along a stream and it's drying up and you want to do some salvaging of the salmon and steelhead that are in that, you should get a hold of me. And I can hook you up with a permit and show you where to put those fish. So, and how to handle them best so that they're not going belly up. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Aluna. All right, thanks, Ryan. I'll
Take care.
see you guys later.